And what we see in the data is that Americans aren't just spending more time alone year after year, decade after decade. There's actually never been a period in recorded history when Americans have spent so little time doing face-to-face socializing and so much time being alone.
The last 1,000 animals born never learned to develop the social behaviors.
The lone wolf, the Einzelgänger, the loner. These are the men who walk alone, thrive alone, and embrace solitude as their greatest strength. But let me ask you this. What if that's not your path? What if solitude doesn't feel empowering but isolating? What if it's draining instead of fulfilling? You ever look around and wonder, where is everybody? Why does it feel like people are disappearing? Not physically, but socially? Well, it's not just in your head. This is the loneliest era in human history. Welcome to Manosphere Highlights Daily. In this video, we're tackling the loneliness epidemic gripping modern society, breaking down the sociology behind it, and of course, exposing some of that dating foolishness. Human behavior impacts society, and society impacts human behavior. It's a never-ending cycle. For this discussion, we're diving into a segment from CBS Mornings, where they call this era the anti-social century. More people than ever are choosing to be alone. But at what cost? Let's talk about it.
Ain't that a man?
We talk about a loneliness epidemic. People talk about the crisis of loneliness in America. But what you point out is that a lot of people hearing my voice right now may not actually feel lonely, but based on all the data and the argument that you've pulled together, they're still spending a lot of time alone. And that time alone is contributing to a problem. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you do have that right. There's a difference between aloneness and loneliness. I mean, there's many times that I spend alone. I'm the father of a 17-month-old. So there's times when I spend alone at a bar or, just like having a drink by myself. And I'm like, oh my God, thank God, this is the next thing to heaven. Sometimes being in a state of quiet by yourself is a lovely thing. But chronic loneliness, being alone day after day, being alone more year after year, that's a real problem. That tends to correlate with much less happiness and with serious problems, both for individual health and I think for community health. And what we see in the data is that Americans aren't just spending more time alone year after year, decade after decade. There's actually never been a period in recorded history when Americans have spent so little time doing face-to-face socializing and so much time being alone. I mean, that's according to official government records. So that's the real problem here. It is social isolation, not just periodic loneliness.
And go ahead.
Go ahead.
Chronic loneliness, guys. Being alone day after day, week after week is a serious issue. Guys, I get it. Some of you are going your own way or going monk mode because of all of that dating foolishness. But let me tell you something. This isolation, cutting yourself off from family, friends, and any kind of meaningful connection, it's not healthy. Just because you're tired of the nonsense doesn't mean you should throw in the towel on yourself. The foolishness. So let me bring you some of that positive energy right now. Your life matters. Take a moment right now to appreciate what you have. The fact that you're still here, still fighting, means you're capable of so much more. Protect yourself at all times also means take care of yourself at all times. That includes your mind, your body, and your spirit. Now, let's look at this graph. Look at how loneliness has skyrocketed since 2005. Why? That's when technology, smartphones, and social media started taking over. Modern society is training us to be alone. This trend starts in adolescence, and if you're passive, it will drag you deeper into isolation. If you're struggling with loneliness, be honest with yourself. Every journey starts with a single step. It's far worse to pretend everything's fine while you're struggling than to admit you're lonely and take action. It's not weakness, it's courage.
What's problematic with that, Derek? I mean, everybody needs a little me time, right? Isn't there also an argument for recharging in order to be a better person in society?
There's a very strong argument for a little bit of me time. I mean, I think it's really important for people to find quiet in their lives in order to recharge. But one thing that I think our devices, our phones, our screens do is they make our alone time more crowded, because when we're alone, what do? We pull out our phones and we spend time in the minds and crowds of other people, which are often very anxious, often very angry, often very negative and emotional. And sometimes when we're in a crowd, what do? We feel a little bit of social anxiety, we pull out our phones, and suddenly we're alone. So in a weird, almost paradoxical way, our alone time is more crowded than it used to be, and our time in crowds is more lonely than it used to be. And this makes it harder, I think, to have true social connection. And so I think it's really important to recognize that, yes, of course, it's great that people have time to be alone, time to find real quiet. But the actual problem we're talking about here is not periodic quiet. It's the fact that Americans, the choices they make in the world that we've constructed in the physical world, are experiencing a kind of social isolation that we've never had before in this country. And I think that's a social experiment that has gone awry.
This gives me serious Mouse Utopia vibes. Have you heard of the Mouse Utopia experiment? It was a behavioral study where mice were given a perfect environment with unlimited food, water, and space. But instead of thriving, something disturbing happened.
The last 1,000 animals born never learned to develop the social behaviors. They never learned to be aggressive, which is necessary in defense of home sites. They never learned to court. There was no mating. Being no mating, there were no progeny. And the older animals, whose behavior was already becoming disrupted, they eventually reached an age too old to reproduce. And so it was all left up to these last 1,000 or so, whom we call the beautiful ones, because not engaging in any stressful activity and only paying attention to themselves, they groomed themselves well, so they looked very fine specimens. But from that point on, which was about the time that you were here 2.5 years ago, this reproduction totally ceased, and the animals have just aged and died.
Notice what's happening here. The mice stopped mating. They stopped socializing. Instead of forming strong groups, they retreated into themselves. The most extreme cases were called the beautiful ones. Mice who did nothing but groom themselves all day, avoiding any social interaction. Sound familiar? Today, people are growing up surrounded by screens and social media, stuck in a paradox, alone in a crowd, crowded while alone.
Calhoun later said that the creatures had died 2 deaths. The first was that of their spirit and their society. The second death was that of their physical body.
The mice couldn't return to their natural behaviors, even when the experiment reset. But here's the thing. We are not mice. We can break the cycle, but only if we're active, not passive.
So Derek, it sounds like your advice to people, if I would turn your article into a self-help bullet point, would be call a friend today. Make a plan to see that friend in real life and put the phone down while you're together.
What I want to do with this article is I want to hold up a mirror to Americans' behavior. I think we've made a lot of choices with our lives without recognizing the cost of those choices. You know, we watch Netflix more than we used to. We stay at home much more than we used to. We spend 99 extra minutes at home per day, not just working, but eating and praying and doing just about every other activity than we did just 20 years ago. We make lots of decisions based on convenience and technology to spend more time by ourselves. And what I want to do with this is to hold up like a receipt and say, this is what you've bought with your decisions. You've bought more alone time than ever. And here are all these psychologists that I've spoken to who say that chronic social isolation makes us more unhappy as individuals and makes us more unhealthy as a community. So yes, the individual choice here can be call a friend, see someone, don't celebrate the cancellation of that plan, make another plan. But also I think it's important to say that these are collective action problems. If your friends are hanging out more, it's easier to make a plan. If your friends are making more dinner parties, it's easier to make the next dinner party. So yes, we can solve these problems as individuals, but they really do need to be solved at the level of a community.
Nobody promised life would be easy, despite what modern society might have you believe. But here's the truth. You can do something about loneliness. The key word here is do. Action is the antidote to isolation. And here's the kicker. Despite the grim statistics, there's hope. Look at the data again. Boys have consistently spent more time with friends than girls since the 1980s. Why? Because men build camaraderie through practical activities, whether it's sports, hobbies, or even just hanging out. These connections are built on shared experiences, not surface-level nonsense. Don't sleep on this. If you haven't already, check out our video on Nora Vincent. She disguised herself as a man to experience life as we do. Her takeaway? Men's spaces are built on acceptance and practicality. Women, not so much. It's easier to connect with other men, especially when you have a shared purpose. Here's your challenge. By the end of this video, I want you to think of one way you can break out of isolation this week. Whether it's hitting the gym, reaching out to an old friend, or joining a local group, take action. Comment below what you're gonna do. Don't let modern society isolate you. Build connections. Get out there. Surround yourself with people who align with your purpose. And remember, this anti-social society doesn't define you. You define you. Fellas, stay sharp, stay focused, and as always, man, it's we working. Protect yourself at all times. This video has officially been highlighted.